The restaurant was nearly silent when the single father sat down to dinner alone with his young son. No one paid him much attention until a little girl, no older than 6, walked over without warning, tugged gently at his sleeve, and whispered in a trembling voice, "My mom cries every night because of you." The fork in the man's hand went still. The woman in the corner of the room went pale. The child beside him looked up in total confusion. Nobody in that restaurant understood what was happening. But within minutes, a secret buried for years would begin tearing everything apart. Cameron Hayes was not the kind of man who drew attention to himself. At 27, he had the kind of face that seemed permanently braced for something not quite sadness, not quite worry, but something quieter and more permanent than either. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and kept his dark hair cut close. He wore a clean flannel shirt on nights like this one, which meant it was a special occasion. Not a big one, just the kind that mattered between a father and his son. That evening, the two of them sat in a window booth at Hargrove's, a small neighborhood restaurant on the east side of the city. It was the kind of place where the lighting stayed warm, the menu hadn't changed in 15 years, and the staff knew regulars by name. Cameron had chosen it carefully not for himself, but because Luke loved the macaroni and cheese they made from scratch, and today was Luke's 6th birthday. Luke Hayes was small for his age, with enormous brown eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He was wearing a striped sweater, the one Cameron had wrapped himself in brown paper and twine that morning. Luke had held it up carefully before putting it on, smoothing every fold, as if it were something precious. He was that kind of boy, gentle with things, gentle with people, always watching. Now he sat across from his father, pushing a forkful of macaroni around his plate, the kind of quiet that meant something was turning over in his mind. "Dad," Luke said finally. Cameron looked up. "Yeah, bud? How come you never bring someone with you? Like, a special person?" Cameron set his fork down slowly. He looked at his son's face wide open, curious, completely without guile, and he felt the familiar ache he always felt when Luke asked questions like this. Not because they were hard, but because they were so easy for Luke to ask and so impossible for Cameron to answer. "I like it just being us," Cameron said. Luke thought about this for a moment. Then, "But I have friends at school." "You don't have any friends." Cameron almost laughed. "Almost. I have friends. Name one." He couldn't, not quickly enough. And Luke's expression shifted slightly, not unkind, just honest. He saw through his father the way children sometimes do, with a clarity that adults spend years learning to avoid. Cameron reached across and ruffled his son's hair. "We should order cake." Luke allowed the subject to change, but his eyes stayed on his father a beat longer than they needed to. He was watching again. Cameron had spent the last 6 years watching too, just in a different direction. He watched doorways. He watched the spaces between tables. He scanned faces without meaning to. The habit of a man who had learned to expect the unexpected in the worst possible way. He wasn't wearing a wedding ring. He never had. Actually, there had never been a ceremony, never been a ring to take off. Just a woman who had left when things got hard. And a son who had stayed. He kept his coat on even inside. He held his coffee cup with both hands. Small things. Habits of a man who had been cold for a long time. From across the restaurant, a piano began to play. Cameron went still. It was an old piece, soft, unhurried, the kind of melody that belonged to another era. He couldn't have named it, not exactly. But he knew it. Deep in the part of the body where memory doesn't live in words, he knew it. And for just a moment, the noise of the restaurant fell away completely. In the far corner of the room, a young woman sat at a small upright piano near the window. She played with her eyes half closed, her fingers moving as if the music were something that had always been there inside her, and she was only letting it out. She was perhaps a year younger than Cameron, with dark hair pinned loosely at the back of her neck, a pale blue dress, and an expression that was impossible to read from that distance. Cameron stared. Then Luke said, "Dad? You okay?" He pulled his gaze back. "Yeah," he said. "Fine." But his hand was trembling slightly when he reached for his glass. Across the room, a little girl in a yellow dress slipped down from her seat at a nearby table. She walked steadily between the tables, purposeful, unhurried, as if she knew exactly where she was going. She stopped beside Cameron's booth. She looked up at him, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "My mom cries every night because of you." The words landed in the quiet of the restaurant like a stone dropped into still water. Cameron did not move. He did not speak. His fork rested against the edge of his plate, untouched, and the only sound in his immediate vicinity was the soft, continued melody of the piano across the room which, one moment later, also stopped. Grace Bennett had not seen her daughter leave the table. She had been so deep inside the music, inside the particular kind of silence that playing created for her, that she had lost track of Ella entirely, and now she stood up so fast her bench scraped the floor, and she crossed the restaurant in a dozen long strides, her face drained of color before she even reached them. Ella. Her voice was low and controlled, the tone she used when she needed Ella to understand that this was serious. Come back to the table. But Ella did not move. She kept her eyes on Cameron with the solemn certainty of a child who has decided something important. 6-year-olds are not always wrong about the things they decide. I'm so sorry, Grace said, directing the words at Cameron but not quite looking at him. She didn't mean she must have mistaken you for someone else. I didn't make a mistake, Ella said clearly. Grace reached for her daughter's hand. Ella, I saw his picture in Mom's box. Ella's chin was trembling now, but she held her ground with a kind of stubborn grace that belonged entirely to her. The one in the closet, the one Mom looks at and then cries. A short silence settled over the table. Luke looked between his father and the little girl, and then up at the woman standing behind her, and his expression was the careful, bewildered look of a child trying very hard to understand something that belongs to adults. Cameron's jaw had tightened. He wasn't looking at Grace anymore either. He was looking somewhere slightly past her, at the empty wall behind her shoulder, as if he were calculating something that required stillness to solve. A box, he said quietly. Grace finally looked at him directly, and in the moment their eyes met, something happened, not softness, not recognition of the pleasant kind, but the opposite. The sudden, terrible recognition of something buried, something neither of them had said aloud in years. I think there's been a misunderstanding, she said carefully. Has there? The word hung there. Grace felt the blood leave her face completely. We should go. But Cameron's voice was steady when he spoke again. 7 years ago, he said. County General. A car accident. Rain. Grace's hand tightened around Ella's. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. For a long moment the two of them stood there, a woman who had spent 7 years building a version of that night she could live with, and a man who had spent just as long trying to forget it. Luke slipped his hand into his father's. Dad? He whispered. Cameron looked down at his son. Something flickered across his face, pain, and behind the pain something older and quieter. He placed his hand gently on the back of Luke's head, and then he stood. He pulled on his coat. He reached into his pocket and set a few folded bills on the table for the check. He did all of this slowly, and with the kind of care that people use when they are trying not to fall apart in public. At the doorway he turned. He didn't look at Grace the way a man looks at someone he's angry at. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has already said goodbye to 100 times before. If you knew the full truth, he said quietly, you wouldn't want to hear it. And then he walked out into the evening, and the door swung shut behind him. And the restaurant was quiet again, and the piano did not start playing. The apartment Grace and Ella came home to was small and warm, in a deliberate way, the kind of warmth that takes effort, that you create with potted plants and good curtains and the smell of something always simmering on the stove. It was a home assembled against emptiness, piece by piece, the way people do when they've decided to survive on their own terms. Ella changed into her pajamas without being told. She climbed into the big chair in the living room and pulled her knees to her chest and watched her mother with the patient, watchful expression that she'd had since she was old enough to understand that her mother carried something heavy. Was that the man? She asked. Grace was standing at the kitchen counter with both hands flat on the surface, staring at nothing. What man? The one from the box. A silence. Ella, I need you to stop asking about the box. Ella was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then, is he a bad man? Grace turned. She looked at her daughter, really looked at her, the way she did when she needed to find an honest answer. And the honest answer was that she didn't know anymore. She had known, with complete certainty, for 7 years. She had been so sure. But something had happened in that restaurant tonight. Something that had loosened a thread she hadn't expected to be loosened. She crossed the room and sat beside Ella, and kissed the top of her head, and said nothing at all. Later, after Ella was asleep, Grace knelt in the back of her bedroom closet and pulled out the shoebox. She hadn't opened it in months. She told herself she had outgrown it, that she had processed the grief and moved forward. Neither of these things was entirely true. Inside the box, a photograph of her brother Daniel, taken the summer before he died. A folded newspaper clipping, the edges soft with age, describing the accident in 6 short paragraphs of local news. A hospital intake form, and at the bottom, on a small square of paper, a name written in blue ink by a nurse at County General. Cameron Hayes. She had looked up that name 17 times in 7 years. She had never found much a social media page long since deleted. A brief mention in the original accident report as a bystander who rendered aid. The word bystander had always stopped her. It felt wrong. It felt like the wrong word for someone who had been the last person to see her brother alive. Her brother Daniel had been 22. He had been the person who taught her to play piano. He had driven in the rain to bring her soup when she was sick, every single time she was sick, because that was the kind of person he was. He had died in the emergency room at 11:40 in the evening, and no one had been there with the family in those final hours. No one except a stranger whose name she had written on a piece of paper and kept for 7 years because she didn't know what else to do with it. She folded the paper back into the box and closed the lid. Across the city, in a 2-room apartment above a laundry, Cameron sat at the kitchen table in the dark and listened to the sound of his son breathing from the next room. He had tucked Luke in an hour ago. Luke had asked no more questions, which was generous of him, and Cameron had held his hand until the boy fell asleep. Now he sat alone, and when Luke's breathing grew long and slow and even, Cameron lowered his head to his arms at the table, and for the first time in a very long time, he cried. 7 years ago, Cameron Hayes was 20 years old and almost nothing. He had dropped out of culinary school after 1 semester because he couldn't afford the second. He was working as a prep cook at a hotel downtown, the kind of job that started at 4 in the morning and ended when your feet gave out. He was renting a room above a laundry with 2 other guys, one of whom worked nights and one of whom snored so loudly it didn't matter. He owned a second-hand car, a set of decent knives, and nothing else. On the night of November 14th, he was driving home from a double shift in the rain. The highway outside the city was the kind of road that looked perfectly safe in good weather and turned treacherous without warning in bad. It was past midnight. The rain had been coming down for 2 hours, and the visibility through his windshield was somewhere between poor and dangerous. He saw the accident from 300 yards away. A sedan had gone into the guardrail at speed. It had spun and come to rest in the center lane on its side, and the rear end was already beginning to smoke. The road was empty, no other cars, no lights, nothing except the rain and the crumpled vehicle and, visible through the shattered window, a man trying and failing to move. Cameron pulled over. He did not think about whether to stop. He did not calculate the risk. He got out of the car in the rain and ran. The man inside was pinned by his door, which had buckled inward. He was conscious barely. He was saying something, over and over, that Cameron couldn't quite make out over the rain. Cameron wedged himself against the frame of the car and pulled and pulled and pulled, until something gave and the door swung free and he was able to drag the man out onto the wet asphalt. His name was Daniel Bennett. Cameron didn't know that yet. He only knew that the man was breathing and bleeding and that smoke was coming from the engine in a way that meant the car was not safe to be near. He called 911. He stayed on the line. He pressed his jacket against the wound in Daniel's side, and he talked to the man about nothing, about everything, about the names of streets and the color of the rain, because someone had told him once that you keep a person talking when you want them to stay. And then he saw the other car. It had come to a stop 50 yards down the road, just past the bend. A dark SUV with one headlight slightly off-center and a scrape of crushed metal along the front quarter panel, the kind of scrape that happens when a vehicle strikes another vehicle at speed. Cameron stared at it for 3 full seconds, and then its lights came on, and it drove away. He had tried to chase it. He had written down what he could remember of the license plate: partial, incomplete, damaged by panic and rain. He had given it to the police when they arrived. He had told them everything, in a statement that took 45 minutes and left him shaking. Months later, he followed up. The investigator assigned to the case told him, in the flat voice of someone who had closed a file, that there was insufficient evidence to pursue the secondary vehicle. That was it. Daniel Bennett died in surgery at 11:40 that evening. Cameron didn't find out until he called the hospital the next morning. He wasn't family. They weren't required to tell him anything, but a nurse, exhausted and at the end of a long shift, had said, "I'm sorry, he didn't make it." Cameron sat in his car outside the hospital for a long time. He never went back to culinary school. He took more shifts. He tried to hold together a life that had, without warning, become weighted with a grief that technically wasn't his to carry, except that he had been there. And Daniel had talked to him, and Cameron had promised to stay, and he had stayed, and it still wasn't enough. Now, in the dim light of his apartment, he found the old newspaper clipping in a drawer he rarely opened. He read it again, slowly, and something in the story, some particular gap between what he remembered and what had been written, felt wrong in a way he hadn't allowed himself to examine before. Ella Bennett had made up her mind before she said a word about it. This was the thing about Ella: she did not announce her decisions. She simply enacted them. So while Grace believed her daughter had quietly accepted the instruction to forget about the man from the restaurant, Ella was already 3 moves ahead. The following Saturday, Grace had a morning student. She taught piano from the living room, with the door open, while Ella was supposed to be reading in her bedroom. Ella was not reading in her bedroom. She was at Hargrove's. She had walked there herself. It was only 4 blocks, and she had done it before with her mother, and she had sat in the booth nearest the window and ordered a lemonade with the $1.50 she had taken from her coat pocket, and proceeded to wait. She didn't have to wait long. Luke Hayes arrived 12 minutes later, also alone, also with the decisive air of someone who had made a plan and was carrying it out. He climbed into the seat across from her without preamble. "Hi," he said. "Hi," Ella said back. For a moment they just looked at each other, 2 6-year-olds who had been presented with an adult-sized problem and had independently arrived at the same solution. "Your mom was sad," Luke said. "Your dad looked really sad too," Ella said. Luke considered this. "He gets that way sometimes. When he thinks I'm asleep." He folded his hands on the table very seriously. "He's not bad, though. He just worries a lot." Ella stirred her lemonade. "Mom's not bad either. She just misses Uncle Daniel." "Who's that?" "He died before I was born. But she still talks to him sometimes. At night, when she thinks I'm asleep." Luke nodded slowly, as if this made a certain amount of sense to him. The two of them sat in companionable silence for a moment. Outside the window, the morning was gray and unhurried. A woman walked past with a dog. A delivery truck idled at the corner. "My dad listens to this one song," Luke said. "Every night after dinner. He thinks I don't notice, but I do. It's slow, and it doesn't have words." Ella looked up sharply. "Is it kind of like this?" She hummed a few bars, hesitant at first, then clearer. Luke stared at her. "Yeah, that's exactly it." Ella set down her lemonade. "That's the song my mom plays. She calls it the goodbye song. But she still plays it every week." They looked at each other across the table with the frank solemnity of children who have just discovered something the adults in their lives have been circling for years. Neither of them was entirely sure what it meant. But they were very sure that it meant something. That evening, Grace drove past Hargrove's on the way home from the grocery store. She slowed without thinking, and through the plate glass window of the restaurant, lit from inside against the gray of the afternoon, she saw Cameron Hayes sitting outside in his car, with the windows slightly fogged and the door cracked open. Luke was curled up against his side in the passenger seat, his head on his father's shoulder, his eyes closed. Cameron was stroking his son's hair very gently, the way you do when you think no one is watching. His lips were moving, maybe singing, maybe talking, maybe just making the small sounds that people make when they're trying to keep someone close. Grace pulled to the curb and sat there for a moment. She had expected, if she ever saw him again, to feel something hard and certain. Instead, she felt something much more complicated than that. Something she didn't have a word for yet. She pulled away before he could see her. Grace was methodical when she wanted answers. She had always been that way. It was what made her a good teacher. She broke things down into their smallest parts and worked through them in order. So when she decided, 3 days after the restaurant, that she needed to understand what had actually happened 7 years ago, she started at the beginning. She requested a copy of the original accident report. She talked to the insurance investigator who had handled Daniel's case. And then, while going through a folder of hospital documents she had kept for years and never fully read, she found it. A series of money transfers, anonymous, sent to the hospital billing department beginning approximately 8 months after Daniel's death. The transfers had come through a third-party payment service and had been applied, without explanation, to the outstanding balance on Daniel's account, a balance that had been slowly crushing their mother for nearly a year. Grace had always assumed her mother had managed it herself, had taken out a second job, or borrowed from someone. Her mother had never said anything different. The transfers had continued for 2 years. The total was not large, but it was more than someone with nothing to spare could have managed easily. Grace called the payment service. It took 3 days and 2 escalations to get a name. The name was Cameron Hayes. She sat with that for a long time. She thought about the apartment she'd grown up in, how the tension around the bills had eased in the year after the accident. How her mother had never explained it. How she'd been too young and too grieving to ask. Then she thought about what it would have cost Cameron to send that money. She pulled up what public records she could find, not much, but enough to sketch an outline. He had worked 3 jobs in the 2 years following the accident. A prep cook position, a laundry route, and overnight stock at a grocery warehouse. There had been a medical debt on his own record from the same period, flagged and sent to collections. Not his, someone else's. It took her another day to piece it together. Luke's mother, a woman named Renee, had filed for emergency medical assistance when Luke was a few months old. Cameron had co-signed the debt. When Renee left shortly afterward, the debt had fallen entirely to Cameron. He had spent 4 years paying it off. He had sent money to Grace's family while paying off someone else's debt, raising a child alone, and working himself to exhaustion. And he had never told anyone. Not the hospital. Not the police. Not a single person who might have given him credit for it. Grace drove to his apartment building. She had found the address through the hospital records, which still had it on file. She sat in her car for 10 minutes. Then she got out and rang the buzzer. When he opened the door, he looked the way he had in the restaurant, unsurprised, braced, as if he had been half expecting this and had simply been waiting for it to arrive. "I found out about the money," she said. He stepped back to let her in. The apartment was exactly what she would have expected. Clean, spare, everything in its place. A child's drawings on the refrigerator. A worn cookbook on the counter. A small photo of Luke on the windowsill, taken somewhere outdoors. Luke laughing at something off camera. Cameron made coffee without asking whether she wanted any. For a while they sat at the kitchen table and didn't speak. Grace held her cup with both hands. Cameron looked at the table. Then she said, "Why didn't you ever say anything?" He was quiet for a moment. "What would I have said?" he asked. She had no answer to that. "I don't need to be forgiven," Cameron said quietly. "I'm not asking for that. I just need you to know, I tried everything I could think of. That night, and after. I tried." He wasn't looking for praise. He wasn't looking for anything. He was just telling her the truth, flatly and without decoration, the way someone tells it when they've been carrying it alone long enough. Grace looked at him across the table, and for the first time in 7 years, the version of that night she had built so carefully, the version where there was a villain and a victim, and a clear line of blame began to quietly come apart. The detail had been in the back of Cameron's mind for 7 years. He hadn't pushed on it, because pushing on things hadn't gotten him anywhere before. But now, with Grace sitting across his kitchen table, and the old newspaper clipping spread out between them, he found himself saying it out loud for the first time. "The car that drove away," he said. "I saw it clearly enough to know one thing. The right rear panel was repainted. It was a slightly different shade, darker blue, the kind of thing you see on a car that's had bodywork done, but not perfectly matched." Grace stared at him. "I put it in my statement," he said. "Twice. But it never appeared in any of the follow-up reports. I figured the investigator just didn't think it was relevant. That was the thread." Grace found the garage owner 3 days later. His name was Arthur Price, and he had run a small body shop a mile from the accident site for 26 years. He was in his 70s now, retired, living with his daughter out east. But he remembered. A dark SUV with a repainted right rear panel had come in at 7 in the morning on November 15th, the day after the accident. The driver had been a young man, well-dressed, anxious, and very specific about paying in cash. Arthur had noted the panel damage. He had noted the timeline. He had not called the police because the man's father, who arrived 2 hours later, had explained the situation very calmly and very clearly, and had left Arthur with enough cash that he didn't ask additional questions. The man's name was Trent Alderson. His father was Marcus Alderson, owner of a regional logistics company with enough money to make inconvenient things disappear quietly. Trent had been 24 at the time. He now worked for his father's company. He had never been charged with anything. Grace brought the information to Cameron. They sat at his kitchen table again. It had become, somehow, their working surface and spread out everything they had. Cameron recognized the name Alderson. He had seen it on a piece of mail once, years ago, in a stack of documents. An investigator had sent him without explanation. He had set it aside. He hadn't known what to do with it. He still wasn't entirely sure, but Grace knew a lawyer. And the lawyer, it turned out, was very interested. In the days that followed, something else happened that neither of them had planned for. They kept ending up in the same rooms. They talked longer than the investigation required. Cameron showed Grace the cookbook he had been annotating for years, small notes in the margins, substitutions, things he had learned. Grace played the piano while Luke sat on the floor nearby and listened with an expression of complete absorption. Luke and Ella, for their part, had given up all pretense of subtlety. They sat together at every opportunity and had started quietly engineering moments where their parents were left alone in the same room. Cameron noticed. He chose not to mention it. One evening, after the lawyer had sent over a preliminary draft of a complaint against the Alderson family, Grace looked up from the papers and said, "All these years, how did you live with it? The guilt, I mean. Knowing you couldn't stop the other car." Cameron was quiet for a moment. "I didn't live with it well," he said, "but you kept going. I had Luke." Grace looked at her hands. "Daniel would have liked you," she said. It was the first time she had said his name to Cameron directly. It landed in the room gently. The way things land when they've finally been set down after a long time in the air. Cameron didn't say anything, but his shoulders dropped, very slightly, as if something had eased. The call came at 2 in the morning on a Wednesday. Cameron was already awake. He usually was at that hour, and he heard Luke before he heard the sound of labored breathing, a wheeze, thin and high and wrong, coming through the wall of their small apartment. He was in Luke's room in 4 seconds. The asthma had come on without warning. Luke's face was pale in the nightlight, his chest working too hard, his eyes wide and frightened but trying not to be. He held up his inhaler with one hand. He had already tried it. It hadn't been enough. Cameron called 911 with one hand and held Luke against his chest with the other. At the hospital, they settled Luke with a breathing treatment and a nebulizer and the practiced reassurance of the overnight nursing staff. He was going to be fine, the doctor said it clearly and more than once, for Cameron's benefit as much as Luke's, but he needed to stay until morning for monitoring. Cameron sat in the chair beside Luke's bed and did not leave it. He was still there at 6 in the morning when Grace arrived. He didn't know who had called her. Luke claimed not to know either. Ella, later, would confirm nothing. But there she was, coat over her pajamas, hair loose, carrying a paper bag from the all-night bakery on her street, and she took one look at Cameron, at the gray exhaustion in his face, and the way his hand was still resting over his son's wrist, as if to feel the pulse. And she sat down in the chair on the other side of Luke's bed, without saying anything. She unpacked the bag. She handed Cameron a coffee. She handed Luke a small pastry wrapped in wax paper, which Luke accepted with the grave appreciation of a child who understands that this is a significant gesture. They sat like that for a while. Luke drifted in and out of sleep, the hospital filled with the soft sounds of morning. A nurse came to check vitals, smiled at the three of them, and said nothing. After a while, Grace said, "He's going to be all right." "I know," Cameron said, but his voice was rough around the edges. She looked at him. "When did you last sleep?" "I'm fine. That's not what I asked." He didn't answer. He looked at Luke instead, at the rise and fall of his son's chest, the careful, steady work of his breathing, a thing so small and fundamental that you only noticed it when it was threatened. Grace watched him. She had known men who performed caring, who put it on like a coat when it was useful and took it off when it wasn't. Cameron did not perform anything. He simply was, in this chair, in this room, in the specific gravity of a parent who was afraid. There was no audience here. There was only Luke. She thought about her brother again. How Daniel had always been the one to show up. How she had never properly understood, until this moment, the shape of that kind of love, the kind that asked for nothing, that just stayed. Later, when Luke had eaten his pastry and was watching something on a small tablet with headphones, Grace played a piece on the upright piano in the family lounge down the hall. She hadn't planned to, she just sat down and began, and the music came slow, familiar, the same melody she'd been carrying for years. She heard the door open behind her. She didn't turn. Luke was standing there in his hospital gown, holding his IV pole in one hand and Ella's hand in the other. He looked at his father, who had followed him, and was standing in the doorway, and Luke said, carefully and distinctly, "If Ella's mom was here every day, Dad would smile more." Arthur Price agreed to a formal statement. It had taken the lawyer 2 weeks of careful preparation, 3 calls, and 1 meeting at Arthur's daughter's house in which Grace had sat across from the old man and said simply, "His name was Daniel. He was 22 years old, and he taught me how to play piano. I just want people to know what happened to him." Arthur had looked at her for a long time. Then he picked up the pen. The complaint was filed with the city's cold case review unit and a civil attorney on the same day. The Alderson family retained counsel within 48 hours, which was its own kind of confirmation. A journalist Grace knew from the neighborhood had been asking questions about Marcus Alderson's company for unrelated reasons and found himself suddenly very interested in the new angle. The story moved quickly after that. Within 10 days, a second witness came forward, a woman who had been driving behind the Alderson vehicle that night, who had pulled over and not come forward at the time because she had been afraid of the name. With 2 witnesses, the case had weight. With the body shop records, it had documentation. With the lawyer on record, it had structure. Trent Alderson was named in the civil complaint. Marcus Alderson's company became subject to an inquiry. Neither outcome was guaranteed, and the lawyer had been very clear about what justice looked like in cases this cold. But the record had been corrected. The official silence had been broken. Cameron heard the news the way he heard most news, sitting at his kitchen table, coffee going cold beside him. He had known it was coming. He had helped build the case, but hearing it still did something to him that he hadn't anticipated. Not relief, exactly. More like the particular exhaustion that sets in after you've been holding your breath for 7 years. Grace came over that evening. They sat at the table again, which was where they always sat, and she told him the details of what the lawyer had said. And they talked through the next steps, and at some point the conversation shifted, without either of them marking the moment. He had been making dinner when she arrived, a simple pasta. Nothing elaborate, and he set a second plate without asking. They ate together, and it was natural in the way that things are natural when they have been building toward you for longer than you've admitted. After dinner, Grace reached into her bag and set something on the table between them. It was a small gold chain with a pendant, a thin crescent, delicate and slightly worn. The clasp was bent. "I've had this since the accident," she said. "Someone at the hospital put it in the bag with Daniel's things. I always assumed a nurse pulled it from the car. I never thought to ask who." Cameron looked at the necklace. He was very still. "The car was smoking," he said slowly. "After I got Daniel out, before the ambulance came, I went back in for there was a chain caught on the gear shift. I saw it when I was pulling him out, and I thought it might be important. I thought maybe it was someone's and they'd want it back." He paused. "I left it with the intake nurse. I didn't know who to leave it with." Grace was looking at him. She had not moved. "You went back into the car," she said. "It was only for a second, Cameron." Her voice was very quiet. "The car caught fire 12 minutes after the ambulance arrived." He looked at the necklace and not at her. "I didn't know that," he said. She reached across the table and picked up the chain. She turned it over in her hands. The pendant caught the light from the kitchen window just briefly, like something surfacing. She said softly, "For 7 years I hated a man who went back into a burning car for my brother." She did not cry. She just sat there, holding the necklace, with the full weight of 7 years settling through her, not crushing, just coming to rest. Cameron said, "Getting your brother back won't happen. I know that. But I'm glad you know." Something changed after that evening, and neither of them tried to name it. It was not sudden, and it was not dramatic. It was more the way a room changes when someone finally opens a window that's been painted shut, gradual, quiet. But you feel the difference immediately. Grace started coming over on Saturdays. Not for the case. The case had its own momentum now. She came because Ella and Luke had begun a practice of piano lessons in the living room. With Grace at the keyboard, and Luke beside her on the bench, his small hands moving carefully over the keys, while Ella supervised from the armchair with the air of an executive managing a project. Cameron would sit at the kitchen table with a book he wasn't reading and listen. He had found the piano in Grace's building storage room, an old upright, badly in need of tuning, which one of her neighbors had been meaning to haul out for years. Cameron had spent a weekend taking it apart, cleaning it, adjusting the pins, replacing 2 hammerheads, and reassembling it with the patient attention he gave everything mechanical. When Grace played it again for the first time, she had sat down, played 1 chord, and gone very still. "When did you learn to tune pianos?" she asked. "Online videos, mostly," he said. "And a book I found at the library. I just wanted to. I don't know." It seemed like it should work properly. She had looked at him for a long moment, in that way she had, like she was recalibrating something. The apartment that had been so careful in its quiet was changing its character. There were 2 children's voices in it now, and the smell of baking on Sunday mornings, and the sound of piano scales drifting through the rooms in the early afternoon. The potted plant on Cameron's windowsill had been watered by someone other than him for the first time in years. He was aware of all of it. He was also afraid. He told Grace this one evening, after the children were in bed and they were sitting on the fire escape in the cold with cups of tea, which was something they had started doing without deciding to. He told her that he was afraid of making things worse, that he had a history of situations going wrong in ways he hadn't anticipated, that the people closest to him had the worst outcomes. "Luke's mother left," he said. "Daniel didn't survive. My own career fell apart. I don't have a great track record for—" He stopped. "For not causing damage." Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The person who hurt me for all those years, who I blamed, who I built up in my mind as the reason everything went wrong, that was never you." She turned to look at him. "You were just the person who stayed when everyone else left. You were the person who went back. You were the person who sent money and never told anyone, and raised a kid alone, and still showed up for people." She paused. "That's not a person who causes damage. That's a person who never got credited for the repairs." Cameron looked at the city below them, the lights, the traffic, the ordinary ongoing life of other people. He turned his palm upward on the railing. Grace set her hand in his. They didn't say anything else. The night was cold, and the city was loud below them. And inside the apartment, 2 children were almost certainly not asleep and were, in all probability, listening very carefully through the window. But for the first time in a very long time, Cameron didn't feel the need to brace himself against whatever was coming. He just sat there, and let the evening be what it was. 3 months later, Hargroves put on a Friday night recital. It was a small affair, the kind the restaurant had hosted a handful of times over the years, where local musicians played for whoever wandered in, and the kitchen stayed open late, and the lighting went warm and low, and the whole place acquired a temporary quality of being somewhere slightly out of ordinary time. The manager had asked Grace to play. She had said yes without too much deliberation, which was a departure from her usual careful thinking it over, and which she recognized as a sign of something. She arrived early to test the piano. The restaurant was not yet full. The early tables held a few regulars, an older couple near the window, a pair of women with notebooks, a man who always ordered the soup. The staff moved around them, setting up for the evening, adjusting chairs, softening the lights. Luke and Ella arrived together, escorted by a slightly frantic Cameron, who had navigated 2 children's worth of pre-event opinions on what constituted appropriate dinner attire. Luke had worn his striped sweater. Ella had worn 3 accessories that she had refused to remove. Cameron was wearing a clean flannel shirt and the expression of a man who had survived the day. He settled them at a table near the front, with the ease of someone who had been managing this particular circus long enough to have a system. He got them each a glass of juice. He confirmed that yes, the macaroni and cheese was on the menu tonight. He answered 3 questions about how long until Grace started playing. Then he sat back. He looked around the restaurant. It was the same room it had always been, the same warm lighting, the same piano in the corner, the same smell of good food and old wood and coffee. He had been here many times over the past few months. It was no longer the place he associated with dread. The geography of it had simply changed, the way places do when new things happen in them, and the old associations lose their grip. Grace came out from the back, shaking her hands loose at her sides the way she did before she played. She looked at him across the room and smiled. Not the careful smile she had given him in those first weeks, the one that said she was reserving judgment, but the real one, the one that reached her eyes and made her look slightly younger and slightly less armored and entirely herself. He nodded at her. She sat down at the piano. The room went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when music is about to begin, not silent, but attentive. The general noise of an evening briefly holding its breath. And then the first notes came out, and Cameron recognized them immediately, because he had been hearing them his whole adult life in the back of his mind, without knowing why. The slow, unhurried melody, the particular sadness and beauty of it, the way it moved like something remembered rather than played. Luke, beside him, went very still. He turned to look at his father with the same expression he'd had in Hargrove's on his birthday, wide-eyed, knowing, a little too old for his age. And Cameron looked back at him, and said nothing, and put his arm around his son's shoulders. Ella, on Luke's other side, was watching Grace play, with the expression of complete satisfaction of someone whose plan has worked out exactly as intended. She folded her hands in her lap. She was, for once, entirely quiet. The song moved through the room like water. Halfway through, a small hand appeared at Cameron's elbow. He looked down. Ella had slid from her chair and was standing next to him, looking up with those large, serious eyes. "I told you," she said. "What did you tell me?" he asked, though he already knew. "That my mom cries because of you." She climbed up into the empty chair beside him and settled herself with great authority. "But now she smiles because of you too." Cameron looked at this child, this small, certain, astonishing creature who had walked across a restaurant 3 months ago and set everything in motion, and felt something rise in his chest that was too large and too gentle to properly name. "Yeah," he said. "I think that might be right." On the small stage, Grace played on. The evening deepened. The restaurant filled. The warm light settled over everyone in it, the regulars, the newcomers, the 2 children sharing a plate of macaroni, the man who had once sat here alone believing he had no right to anything better. Cameron watched Grace's hands move across the keys. He thought about all the years the music had played, on both sides of a wall neither of them had known was there. He thought about the road in the rain, and the car, and the necklace on the gear shift, and all the small invisible threads that had been pulling 2 people toward the same room for 7 years without their knowledge. He thought about the word bystander, and how wrong it had always been. He was not a bystander. He had never been. He was someone who stopped, someone who stayed, someone who went back. It had cost him, and it had taken time, and the accounting of it had never been fair. But here was the ledger, finally balanced. Here was the room that had once held only his solitude, now holding something entirely different. Here were 2 children. Here was the music. Here was the woman who had learned to trust him, the way trust actually happens slowly, imperfectly, by accumulation. The melody reached its final phrase, and Cameron Hayes, for the first time in years that he had stopped counting, did not feel the need to be anywhere other than exactly where he was. The last note faded. The room breathed, and in the quiet that followed the long, warm, unhurried quiet of an evening that had no more secrets left to keep, he understood that this was what it felt like when something you had given up on came back to you in a form you hadn't known to look for. Sometimes the people who change your life arrive as a whisper, and sometimes, if you're still enough to hear it, that whisper is everything.